Move to coach. Those weren't words of courtesy or explanation. They were delivered like a verdict, sharp, final, and loud enough for half the first-class cabin to hear. Rebecca Coleman, senior flight attendant for Skyline Airways Flight 447 from Atlanta to Los Angeles, stood in the aisle with her clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her smile was regulation perfect, and her tone carried the kind of authority that had never been questioned before. She wasn't asking, she wasn't explaining, she was commanding. She looked directly at them, at the elderly black couple seated in 2A and 2B, and repeated herself with even more conviction. I need you both to gather your belongings and move to the coach immediately. There's been an error with your seating assignment. What she didn't know was that in exactly 2 minutes, the man walking up the jet bridge would not only recognize the couple she was humiliating, but would also hold the power to ground her career permanently. Clarence Washington, 73, adjusted his reading glasses and looked up from the newspaper he'd been quietly reading. Beside him, his wife Dorothy, 71, clutched her worn leather purse a little tighter. They had been sitting peacefully in their assigned first-class seats for nearly 20 minutes, watching other passengers board, minding their own business. Clarence wore a simple gray cardigan over a white collared shirt. Dorothy had on a navy dress with small white flowers, the kind she might wear to church on Sunday. They looked like any grandparents heading to visit family, which is exactly what they were. But Rebecca Coleman saw something different. She saw two people who didn't match her mental picture of who belonged in first class. I'm sorry, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. But we need to verify your tickets again. There seems to be some confusion. Clarence reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out their boarding passes, both clearly marked with seat numbers 2A and 2B, both stamped with the first-class designation. These are our seats, he said calmly, his voice carrying the patience of a man who had dealt with this kind of treatment before. We checked in online this morning. Rebecca took the boarding passes and studied them like they might confess to being forgeries. She held them up to the overhead light, squinted at the print, and shook her head slowly. I'm seeing some irregularities here, she announced loud enough for passengers 3 rows back to hear. We're going to need to sort this out. From seat 3C, Kevin Harper, a business traveler in his 40s, looked up from his laptop. He'd watched the entire exchange unfold, and something about it felt wrong. Those look like legitimate boarding passes to me, he said quietly. Rebecca shot him a look that could have frozen the cabin air. Sir, I'm going to need you to let me handle this. This is a crew matter. But Kevin didn't back down. I'm just saying, they've been sitting there peacefully for 20 minutes. Their seats match their tickets. What's the actual problem? The actual problem, Rebecca said, her voice rising slightly, is that we've had reports of fraudulent bookings on this route. We have protocols to follow. Dorothy Washington spoke for the first time, her voice soft but steady. Young lady, we paid for these seats. We have our confirmation email right here on my phone. She reached into her purse and pulled out an older smartphone, fingers moving carefully across the screen. Rebecca didn't even look at the phone. Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but company policy requires me to verify premium seating assignments when there are discrepancies. What discrepancies? Clarence asked, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel underneath. We showed you our boarding passes. They match our seats. We went through security like everyone else. What exactly is the discrepancy? Rebecca's jaw tightened. The discrepancy, sir, is that these seats were flagged in our system as potentially fraudulent bookings. We've seen this before. People use stolen credit cards, fake confirmations, that sort of thing. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Several passengers had stopped their conversations to listen. A woman in row 4 gasped softly. A man across the aisle shook his head in disbelief. That's when Jasmine Carter, a junior flight attendant, approached from the galley. She was young, maybe 26, with kind eyes and a genuine smile. She'd been watching the situation unfold, and something about it made her stomach turn. "Rebecca," she said quietly, "I can help verify their reservations through the system if you'd like." Rebecca turned on her sharply. "I've got this handled, Jasmine. Please return to your duties." But Jasmine had already seen enough. She'd worked for Skyline Airways for 3 years, and she'd never seen boarding passes examined with this level of scrutiny. She'd never seen passengers asked to prove their legitimacy after being seated, and she'd certainly never seen the word fraudulent thrown around so casually. From his seat, Kevin Harper pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is ridiculous," he said. "They're being harassed for no reason." "Sir," Rebecca snapped, "recording is not permitted during boarding procedures." "Actually," Kevin replied, checking his phone, "there's no FAA regulation against recording passenger interactions, and this seems like something people should see." That's when Rebecca made her first major mistake. She called for backup. Over the intercom, her voice echoed through the cabin. "Captain Stevens, please report to the first-class cabin. We have a situation that requires your attention." The entire cabin fell silent. Passengers who had been settling in for the flight now craned their necks to see what was happening. Flight attendants from coach began moving toward the front of the plane, and somewhere in the jet bridge, still boarding passengers, a man in an expensive suit checked his watch and quickened his pace. Captain Brian Stevens emerged from the cockpit, a tall man in his 50s with graying temples and the kind of authority that came from 20 years of flying commercial aircraft. He surveyed the scene, his eyes moving from Rebecca to the elderly couple to the small crowd of passengers now watching intently. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, his voice professional but cautious. Rebecca straightened up, clearly feeling vindicated by his presence. "Captain, we have passengers in first class with questionable tickets. I've flagged their reservations as potentially fraudulent, and I need to relocate them to coach pending verification." Captain Stevens looked at Clarence and Dorothy Washington, then at their boarding passes, which Rebecca still held in her hand. He studied the documents briefly, then looked back at Rebecca with confusion. "These appear to be legitimate boarding passes," he said. "What's the specific concern?" "The specific concern," Rebecca said, her voice growing more defensive, "is that we've had issues on this route with credit card fraud and fake bookings. These passengers don't match the profile of our typical first-class customers, and I'm exercising my authority to verify their legitimacy." The words hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. "Don't match the profile." Several passengers audibly gasped. Someone whispered, "Did she really just say that?" Kevin Harper's phone captured every word. Captain Stevens blinked slowly, processing what he'd just heard. "Rebecca," he said carefully, "what exactly do you mean by profile?" But before Rebecca could answer, the truth of what she meant was already clear to everyone listening. She meant that Clarence and Dorothy Washington, a black elderly couple in simple clothes, didn't look like the kind of people who could afford first-class seats. She meant that their appearance, their age, and their race somehow made them suspicious. She meant that in her mind, first class was for people who looked like her. Clarence Washington had heard enough. He stood up slowly, his 73-year-old frame rising with dignity that commanded respect. "Young lady," he said, his voice steady and strong, "my wife and I have been flying for over 50 years. We've been passengers on this airline for longer than you've been alive. We paid for these seats with our own money. We have the documentation to prove it, and we have done nothing to warrant this treatment." Dorothy remained seated but reached for her husband's hand. Their fingers intertwined, a gesture of mutual support that had carried them through decades of marriage and, clearly, decades of moments like this. That's when the real drama began. Rebecca, instead of backing down, doubled down on her position. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but I have a responsibility to all passengers on this flight to ensure that seating assignments are legitimate. I'm asking you nicely to cooperate with our verification process." "Verification process?" Dorothy finally stood, her voice shaking not with fear but with controlled anger. Child, what verification process involves moving paying customers out of seats they rightfully purchased? Ma'am, Rebecca replied, her tone becoming more condescending. Sometimes people get confused about their seating. Coach is still a comfortable experience, and once we sort this out, if there's been an error, we can discuss compensation. But there was no error, and everyone in first class knew it. The boarding passes were legitimate, the seat assignments were correct, and the only thing that didn't match was Rebecca Coleman's preconceived notion of who deserved to sit in premium seating. Kevin Harper, still recording, turned his phone toward the other passengers. "Are you all seeing this?" he asked. "They're literally trying to move this couple to coach because they don't think they belong in first class." Other passengers began to murmur their agreement. A woman in her 60s spoke up. "This is completely inappropriate. They have their tickets. Leave them alone." A businessman in row 1 added, "I've seen people board in pajamas and flip-flops and nobody questioned their seats. This is clearly targeted." But Rebecca wasn't finished. In fact, she was just getting started. Over the intercom again, her voice echoed through the cabin. "Ground crew, please prepare for possible passenger removal. We may have individuals who need to be escorted off the aircraft." The threat was clear, and it was nuclear. She wasn't just moving them to coach anymore. She was threatening to have them removed from the plane entirely. That's when Jasmine Carter, the junior flight attendant who had tried to help earlier, made a decision that would define her career. She stepped forward, her voice clear and professional. "Rebecca, I need to speak with you privately." "Not now, Jasmine." "Yes, now." Jasmine's tone carried an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. "Rebecca, as a crew member, I'm required to report safety concerns to the captain, and what I'm seeing right now is a safety concern." Captain Stevens, who had been watching the situation escalate with growing alarm, stepped closer. "What kind of safety concern?" Jasmine took a breath, knowing she was about to cross a line she couldn't uncross. "Captain, I believe we have a crew member who is creating a hostile environment for passengers based on discriminatory profiling. This couple has provided all required documentation, they are seated in their assigned seats, and they have done nothing to warrant the treatment they're receiving." The cabin fell dead silent. Rebecca's face flushed red. Jasmine had just publicly accused her of discrimination, and everyone had heard it. "That accusation is completely out of line," Rebecca sputtered. "I am following standard procedures." "What procedures?" Captain Stevens asked. "Because I've been flying for 20 years and I've never seen a procedure that requires passengers to prove they deserve their seats after they've already been seated." But Rebecca had painted herself into a corner. She had made the accusations publicly, she had threatened passenger removal, and she had done it all in front of witnesses who were recording. There was no backing down gracefully. That's when she made her final fatal mistake. She walked over to the overhead bin above seats 2A and 2B, opened it, and began removing Clarence and Dorothy's belongings. "Since you won't cooperate voluntarily," she said, "I'm relocating you to coach under my authority as senior flight attendant." The cabin erupted. Passengers began shouting their objections. Kevin Harper's recording captured every moment. And somewhere on the jet bridge, just seconds away from boarding, Roland Mitchell quickened his pace as he heard raised voices coming from the aircraft. Clarence Washington, a man who had served his country in Vietnam, who had worked for 40 years as a high school principal, who had raised 3 children and helped raise 7 grandchildren, watched a flight attendant pack his belongings like he was a criminal being evicted. But he didn't shout, he didn't curse, he didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he looked Rebecca Coleman directly in the eyes and said the words that would haunt her for the rest of her career. "Young lady, you have no idea what you've just done." And as those words left his lips, a figure appeared in the doorway of the aircraft. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even in silence. Roland Mitchell, owner and CEO of Skyline Airways, had just boarded his own plane. He took one look at the chaos in first class, one look at the elderly couple being humiliated by his employee, and one look at the passengers recording the entire incident. What he did next would make aviation history. Roland Mitchell didn't announce himself. He didn't flash credentials or demand attention. He simply stood at the entrance of the first-class cabin, his dark suit impeccable, his expression unreadable, and watched his senior flight attendant commit career-ending mistake after career-ending mistake. For 30 seconds he observed the scene in complete silence. The elderly black couple standing beside their seats while their belongings were being removed from the overhead compartment. The flight attendant treating paying customers like criminals. The passengers recording what would soon become a viral nightmare for his airline. Rebecca Coleman had her back to the boarding door, completely focused on her mission to relocate the Washingtons to coach. She was explaining loudly to Captain Stevens why her actions were justified, why company policy supported her decision, and why she was protecting the airline from fraudulent passengers. She had no idea that the man who signed her paychecks was standing directly behind her, listening to every word. Roland Mitchell was 25 years old, a self-made billionaire who had built Skyline Airways from a regional carrier into one of the most respected airlines in the country. He was also a black man who had faced discrimination in boardrooms, country clubs, and yes, on airplanes throughout his career. What he was witnessing wasn't just bad customer service. It was the kind of systemic prejudice he had spent his entire professional life trying to eliminate. Jasmine Carter, the junior flight attendant who had tried to intervene, noticed him first. Her eyes widened as she recognized the face she'd seen in company newsletters and training videos. She started to speak, but Roland raised a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. He wanted to hear exactly what Rebecca Coleman would say when she thought no one important was listening. Captain Stevens, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation, was trying to find a middle ground. "Rebecca," he said, "perhaps we could simply verify their payment method through the system and resolve this quietly." Rebecca shook her head firmly. "Captain, with all due respect, I've been doing this job for 8 years. I know suspicious behavior when I see it. These passengers are trying to take advantage of our system, and if we don't address it now, word will get out that Skyline Airways can be scammed." The irony was devastating. She was worried about the airline's reputation while actively destroying it in front of a dozen recording devices. Kevin Harper, still filming from seat 3C, spoke up again. "Ma'am, I'm a frequent flyer on this airline. I've seen people board first class in everything from 3-piece suits to torn jeans. What exactly makes these passengers suspicious?" Rebecca turned to face him, her frustration boiling over. "Sir, if you must know, we've had intelligence about credit card fraud specifically targeting premium cabin bookings. These passengers fit the profile of individuals who engage in that type of fraud." The profile. She'd said it again, and this time Roland Mitchell's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what profile she was referring to, and it had nothing to do with credit card algorithms or booking patterns. It had everything to do with the color of the Washington's skin. Dorothy Washington, who had been standing quietly beside her husband, finally reached her breaking point. "Profile?" she asked, her voice trembling with restrained emotion. "What profile would that be exactly?" But before Rebecca could answer, Clarence Washington stepped forward. He had been a high school principal for 4 decades. He had dealt with difficult people, hostile parents, and challenging situations with grace and authority. But he had never been accused of fraud for the crime of existing in a space where someone didn't think he belonged. "Miss," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of experience, "I am going to ask you one time to return our belongings to our seats and allow us to fly in peace. We have done nothing wrong. We have provided all requested documentation, and we are paying customers of this airline." Rebecca's response would later be used in discrimination training seminars as an example of how not to handle customer service. She looked at Clarence Washington, a man old enough to be her grandfather, and said, "Sir, your attitude is exactly why we need to verify your legitimacy. Legitimate passengers don't get defensive when asked to cooperate." The cabin fell silent. Even passengers in coach had stopped their conversations to listen to what was happening in first class. Kevin Harper's recording captured the moment perfectly. The sound of an elderly man being told that his dignity and self-respect were evidence of his guilt. That's when Roland Mitchell decided he'd heard enough. He stepped forward, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who owned the aircraft they were sitting in. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. Rebecca turned around, clearly annoyed at another interruption. "Sir, I'm going to need you to take your seat. We're handling a situation here." Roland Mitchell smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who was about to deliver consequences. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said, "and I believe you're about to tell me what situation you're handling." Rebecca sized him up quickly. Well-dressed black man, probably mid-50s, clearly successful, but not someone she recognized. In her mind, he was just another passenger overstepping his bounds. "Sir," she said with exaggerated patience, "we have passengers in first class with questionable tickets. I'm relocating them to coach pending verification of their payment methods." Roland nodded slowly. "Questionable in what way?" "Their booking doesn't match our typical first-class customer profile, and we've had reports of fraud on this route." "And what profile would that be?" Roland asked, echoing Dorothy Washington's earlier question. Rebecca realized she was treading on dangerous ground, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "Look, I don't want to get into specifics, but we know what legitimate first-class passengers look like, and we know the signs of fraudulent bookings." Roland Mitchell had built his airline empire on the principle that every passenger deserved respect regardless of their appearance, background, or economic status. He had personally written the company's anti-discrimination policies. He had mandated sensitivity training for all customer-facing employees. And now he was watching one of his senior staff members violate every principle his company stood for. "I see," he said quietly. "And you've determined that these passengers," he gestured toward the Washingtons, "don't look like legitimate first-class customers?" Rebecca, sensing that she needed to justify her position more forcefully, made her final catastrophic error. She decided to get specific. "Sir, legitimate first-class passengers typically dress appropriately for premium service. They carry premium luggage. They understand airline etiquette. These passengers are wearing casual clothes, they're carrying old luggage, and frankly, they seem out of place in this cabin." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Every passenger within earshot understood exactly what she meant. The Washingtons didn't belong in first class because they were old, black, and not wealthy enough in appearance to meet her standards. Jasmine Carter, who had been watching Roland Mitchell's reaction carefully, decided it was time to intervene before the situation got worse. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly. Rebecca spun around. "Mr. Who?" Roland Mitchell extended his hand to Clarence Washington. "Mr. Washington, I presume?" he said. "I believe we spoke on the phone last week about your grandson's scholarship application." The entire cabin seemed to freeze. Clarence Washington's eyes widened in recognition, then confusion, then understanding. Dorothy gasped softly as she realized who was standing in front of them. Rebecca Coleman looked from Roland to the Washingtons and back again, her confidence beginning to crack. "I'm sorry, do you know these passengers?" Roland Mitchell turned to face her fully for the first time. "Ms. Coleman," he said, reading her name tag, "I don't just know these passengers. I invited them to fly first class as my personal guests." The lie was smooth, delivered with the kind of authority that made it sound completely plausible. Roland had never met the Washingtons before this moment, but he understood that sometimes the truth needed a strategic adjustment to serve justice. Rebecca's face began to drain of color. "Your personal guests?" "That's correct." Roland's voice carried the tone of a man who was not accustomed to being questioned. "Mr. and Mrs. Washington are traveling to Los Angeles for their grandson's graduation from USC. Their grandson happens to be one of the recipients of the Skyline Airways Scholarship Program, which I personally oversee." Another smooth fabrication, delivered with such conviction that even Kevin Harper stopped recording to listen more intently. But Rebecca, instead of recognizing the lifeline she was being offered, doubled down on her mistake. "Sir, I don't care who invited them. Company policy requires verification of all first-class bookings when irregularities are detected, and I detected irregularities." Roland Mitchell nodded slowly. "And what irregularities did you detect specifically?" "Well," Rebecca stammered, "their appearance, their luggage, their general demeanor." "Their appearance?" Roland repeated. "You found their appearance irregular?" "They don't look like typical first-class passengers," Rebecca said, her voice beginning to shake as she realized the conversation was spiraling beyond her control. "Ms. Coleman," Roland said, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute authority, "can you describe for me what a typical first-class passenger looks like?" The question was a trap, and Rebecca was walking straight into it. "Well," she said hesitantly, "typically they're business travelers, or families on vacation, or—" She trailed off, realizing that any answer she gave would reveal her underlying prejudices. "Or what?" Roland pressed. "Or people who can afford first-class tickets," she finished weakly. "And you determined that Mr. and Mrs. Washington couldn't afford first-class tickets based on what criteria?" Rebecca looked around the cabin, suddenly aware that every eye was on her, every phone was pointed in her direction, and every word she spoke was being recorded for posterity. "Based on standard profiling procedures," she said desperately. "Standard profiling procedures," Roland repeated. "Ms. Coleman, as senior flight attendant, you're aware of Skyline Airways' anti-discrimination policies, correct?" "Of course," Rebecca said quickly, "but this isn't discrimination. This is fraud prevention." "I see." Roland reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "Ms. Coleman, I'm going to make a call to corporate headquarters. I think they'll be very interested to hear about these standard profiling procedures you've mentioned." Rebecca watched in growing horror as Roland dialed a number and put the phone to his ear. "Yes, this is Roland Mitchell. I'm on Flight 447 and I need to speak with Lisa Bennett in Human Resources immediately." The name Roland Mitchell seemed to register with Captain Stevens first. His eyes widened as he realized exactly who was standing in his first-class cabin. Rebecca Coleman, however, was still focused on defending her actions. "Sir," she said, "I don't know who you think you are, but I don't answer to passengers about my crew decisions." Roland held up one finger, continuing his phone conversation. "Lisa, I'm witnessing a discrimination incident on one of our flights. I need a full investigation team standing by when we land in Los Angeles." That's when it hit Rebecca like a lightning bolt. Roland Mitchell, the owner of the airline, the man whose picture hung in every Skyline Airways office and training facility, the man who could end her career with a single phone call. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her. "Mr. Mitchell," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I didn't know. I was just following procedure." But Roland wasn't finished with his phone call. "Lisa, I want you to pull the audio from this flight. I want a complete review of crew conduct, and I want recommendations for policy changes to prevent this from happening again." Rebecca Coleman, who just minutes earlier had been forcibly removing passengers' belongings from overhead compartments, now stood paralyzed with the realization that she had just committed professional elimination in front of the one person who could ensure she never worked in aviation again. Clarence Washington, who had maintained his dignity throughout the entire ordeal, stepped forward. "Mr. Mitchell," he said quietly, "we appreciate your intervention, but we don't want special treatment. We just want to be treated like every other passenger." Roland ended his phone call and looked at Clarence with genuine respect. "Mr. Washington, the treatment you've received today is unacceptable by any standard. This isn't about special treatment. This is about basic human decency." He turned to face the entire first-class cabin, his voice carrying clearly to every passenger. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to apologize personally for what you've witnessed today. This behavior does not represent the values of Skyline Airways, and I assure you it will be addressed immediately and permanently." Rebecca Coleman, her career now in free fall, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Mr. Mitchell, if I could just explain the procedures I was following." "Ms. Coleman," Roland said, turning to face her with the kind of look that could freeze fire. You will remain silent until we land. Captain Stevens, I want this crew member restricted from passenger contact for the remainder of this flight. Captain Stevens, who had been watching the situation unfold with growing dread, nodded immediately. Rebecca, you're to report to the galley and remain there until we reach Los Angeles. But what about my duties? Rebecca asked weakly. Ms. Carter will handle your duties, Roland said, nodding toward Jasmine. Ms. Coleman, your duties as they relate to passenger service are suspended pending investigation. As Rebecca Coleman walked toward the back of the aircraft, her 8-year career with Skyline Airways effectively over, the passengers in first class began to process what they had just witnessed. Kevin Harper saved his recording and immediately began uploading it to social media. Other passengers started making phone calls, texting friends, and posting updates. Within minutes, the story would be spreading across the internet. Airline owner witnesses his own employee discriminate against elderly black couple. But Roland Mitchell wasn't finished. He had a company to protect, employees to educate, and a wrong to make right. What happened next would set a new standard for how airlines handled discrimination incidents. He looked at Clarence and Dorothy Washington, who were finally able to return to their seats with dignity intact, and said the words that would define his legacy. Mr. and Mrs. Washington, would you be willing to help me make sure this never happens to anyone else? Roland Mitchell didn't take a seat. Instead, he remained standing in the aisle of the first-class cabin, his presence commanding the attention of every passenger and crew member aboard Flight 447. The elderly couple, Clarence and Dorothy Washington, had finally settled back into their assigned seats, but the tension in the cabin remained thick as fog. Rebecca Coleman's humiliation was complete, but the consequences of her actions were just beginning to unfold. Jasmine Carter, suddenly promoted from junior flight attendant to senior cabin crew by default, approached Roland with a mixture of respect and nervousness. Mr. Mitchell, she said quietly, what would you like me to do about the departure delay? Roland checked his watch. They were now 20 minutes past their scheduled pushback time, and every minute of delay would cost the airline money and inconvenience passengers. But some things were more important than schedules. We'll delay departure until this situation is properly documented, he said. I want every passenger who witnessed these events to have the opportunity to provide a statement if they choose to do so. Kevin Harper, who had been recording the entire incident, raised his hand slightly. Mr. Mitchell, I have video documentation of everything that happened. I'd be happy to provide it to your investigation team. Roland nodded appreciatively. Thank you, Mr. Harper. That footage will be invaluable in ensuring we have a complete record of events. From seat 4B, an elderly white woman named Margaret Stevens spoke up. I've been flying for 60 years, and I've never seen anything like this. That poor couple did nothing wrong, and they were treated like criminals. Her husband, seated beside her, added, We saw the whole thing. The flight attendant was completely out of line from the very beginning. Roland walked slowly through the first-class cabin, making eye contact with each passenger. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, what you witnessed today represents a failure on the part of Skyline Airways. Not just a failure of one employee, but a failure of our systems, our training, and our oversight. I take full responsibility for creating an environment where this kind of discrimination could occur. The passengers listened intently as the billionaire owner of a major airline took personal accountability for the actions of his employee. It was unprecedented in an industry known for deflecting blame and hiding behind corporate policies. But I also want you to know, Roland continued, that what happened here today will result in immediate and permanent changes to how this airline operates. We will not simply apologize and move on. We will take action. Captain Stevens, who had been quietly observing from the cockpit doorway, stepped forward. Mr. Mitchell, should I contact air traffic control about our delay? Yes, but tell them we have a passenger service issue that takes priority over our departure slot. Roland's voice carried the authority of someone who understood that some delays were necessary for justice. Then he turned his attention back to the Washingtons. Mr. and Mrs. Washington, I want you to know that Ms. Coleman's behavior today will result in her immediate termination. But beyond that, I want to ask if you would be willing to work with our company to help prevent this from happening to other passengers. Clarence Washington, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the entire ordeal, leaned forward slightly. Mr. Mitchell, we appreciate your response to this situation, but we're curious about how something like this could happen in the first place. Don't you have policies against discrimination? Roland's expression grew serious. We absolutely do have those policies, Mr. Washington. Comprehensive policies that every employee is required to know and follow, which makes what happened here today even more unacceptable. Then how did your senior flight attendant feel comfortable treating us the way she did? Dorothy Washington asked, her voice gentle but pointed. That's exactly the question we need to answer, Roland replied, and I suspect the answer will reveal problems that go deeper than one employee's bad judgment. From the galley area where Rebecca Coleman had been banished came the sound of muffled crying. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. In the span of 30 minutes, she had gone from senior flight attendant to terminated employee, and the entire incident had been recorded and would soon be viral across social media platforms. Jasmine Carter approached Roland again. Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Coleman is asking if she can speak with you privately. Roland considered the request for a moment. Tell Ms. Coleman that anything she has to say can be said in front of the passengers who witnessed her behavior. If she wants to apologize, she can do it publicly. If she wants to explain her actions, she can do that publicly as well. The message was clear. There would be no private damage control, no quiet conversations that might allow Rebecca to minimize her actions. Everything would be transparent and accountable. A few minutes later, Rebecca Coleman emerged from the galley, her makeup smeared, her composure completely shattered. She walked slowly toward the front of the first-class cabin, where Roland Mitchell stood like a judge waiting to hear her defense. Mr. Mitchell, she began, her voice shaking, I want to apologize for my behavior today. I made mistakes, and I understand why you're upset. Roland's expression remained neutral. Ms. Coleman, who are you apologizing to? I'm apologizing to you, sir, and to the company. And what about Mr. and Mrs. Washington? Roland asked pointedly. Rebecca looked toward the elderly couple who watched her with expressions that mixed hurt, disappointment, and a lifetime of experience with inadequate apologies. Of course, she said. Mr. and Mrs. Washington, I'm sorry for the confusion today. Confusion? Dorothy Washington repeated the word with disbelief. You accused us of fraud. You said we didn't belong in first class. You physically removed our belongings from the overhead compartment. That wasn't confusion, young lady. That was deliberate humiliation. Rebecca's face reddened. I was following security protocols, she said defensively. What security protocols? Roland demanded. Ms. Coleman, I personally approved every security protocol used by this airline. Show me the protocol that instructs flight attendants to profile passengers based on their appearance. Rebecca stammered, realizing she had no policy to cite, no procedure to hide behind. The protocols were all in her head, based on assumptions and prejudices she had never examined. There is no such protocol, Roland said firmly. What you engaged in today was racial profiling, pure and simple. You saw two elderly black passengers in first class and decided they didn't belong there based solely on their appearance. That's not true, Rebecca protested weakly. I was concerned about fraudulent bookings. Based on what evidence? Roland pressed. Their boarding passes were legitimate. Their payment had been processed. They had completed security screening. What evidence did you have of fraudulent activity? They didn't seem like... Rebecca's voice trailed off as she realized that any explanation she offered would only dig her deeper into the hole she had created for herself. Didn't seem like what? Roland asked, his voice cutting through her hesitation like a blade. Finish that sentence, Ms. Coleman. But Rebecca couldn't finish it. because the truth was too ugly to say out loud in front of witnesses, cameras, and the man who owned the airline. The truth was that she had profiled Clarence and Dorothy Washington based on nothing more than their race, their age, and her own prejudiced assumptions about who deserved premium service. Kevin Harper, still recording from his seat, turned his phone toward Rebecca. "This is the moment," he said quietly to his camera, "where someone has to choose between honesty and self-preservation." Clarence Washington, who had been listening to the exchange with the patience of a man who had dealt with discrimination for 7 decades, finally spoke up. "Ms. Coleman," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I'm going to help you finish that sentence. We didn't seem like the kind of people who could afford first-class tickets. We didn't seem like we belonged in the same cabin as your other passengers. We didn't seem like we deserved the same respect you show to younger, whiter customers." The accuracy of his words hit Rebecca like physical blows. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. "Is that correct, Ms. Coleman?" Roland asked. "Did you profile these passengers based on their race?" The cabin fell completely silent. Even passengers in coach had stopped their conversations to listen to the drama unfolding in first class. Rebecca Coleman stood at the crossroads of her career, her integrity, and her future. She could admit to racial profiling and accept responsibility for her actions, or she could continue to deny the obvious truth and dig herself deeper into professional oblivion. She chose poorly. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "I think you're mischaracterizing my actions. I was simply following standard procedures for suspicious passenger behavior." "Standard procedures," Roland repeated, his voice now carrying an edge of barely controlled anger. "Ms. Coleman, I want you to understand something very clearly. I built this airline from nothing. I wrote the policies, I hired the trainers, I personally approved every procedure manual. There is no standard procedure that authorizes what you did today." But Rebecca, perhaps sensing that she had nothing left to lose, decided to make one final stand. "Sir, with all due respect, you weren't here when this started. You didn't see their behavior, their attitude when I asked simple questions about their tickets." "Their attitude?" Dorothy Washington's voice rose for the first time since the incident began. "Child, what attitude did we display other than shock at being treated like criminals for the crime of flying while black?" "Ma'am," Rebecca said, turning to face Dorothy directly, "you became defensive immediately when I asked about your reservations." "We became defensive," Clarence Washington interjected, "because you accused us of fraud without cause, because you spoke to us like we were trying to steal something that we had paid for legally." Roland Mitchell had heard enough. He pulled out his phone again and dialed a number. When the call connected, he spoke loudly enough for everyone in first class to hear. "Lisa, this is Roland again. I need security standing by when we land. I also need a complete audit of Flight 447's crew files, training records, and any previous passenger complaints. And Lisa, I want you to contact our legal department. We may have a civil rights violation here that requires immediate attention." Rebecca's face went white as she realized the full scope of the consequences heading her way. A civil rights violation could mean federal investigation, legal liability, and career-ending publicity for both her and the airline. "Mr. Mitchell," she pleaded, "surely we can handle this internally. I made a mistake, but I don't think it rises to the level of legal action." Roland ended his call and looked at her with an expression that could have frozen jet fuel. "Ms. Coleman, you didn't make a mistake. You engaged in systematic discrimination against paying customers based on their race. You falsely accused them of fraud. You threatened to have them removed from the aircraft. And you did it all publicly, in front of witnesses, while representing this company." He gestured toward the passengers, many of whom were still recording the conversation. "This incident is already spreading across social media. By the time we land in Los Angeles, millions of people will have seen footage of a Skyline Airways employee racially profiling elderly passengers. The damage to our reputation is incalculable." "But the damage to our reputation," Roland continued, "is nothing compared to the damage you've done to Mr. and Mrs. Washington. They paid for first-class service and instead received humiliation, accusation, and disrespect. They were made to feel unwelcome on an aircraft they had every right to be on, simply because their appearance didn't match your personal prejudices. Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but Roland held up his hand for silence. You're terminated, Ms. Coleman, effective immediately. When we land, you'll be escorted from the aircraft by security. Your final paycheck will be processed according to company policy, but your employment with Skyline Airways is over. The finality of the words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. 8 years of employment, gone. Career advancement, destroyed. Professional reputation, annihilated. All because she had allowed her prejudices to override her professionalism and humanity. But Roland wasn't finished delivering consequences. Furthermore, he continued, your actions today will be reported to the Federal Aviation Administration, the Department of Transportation, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. You'll be flagged in the industry database, which means no major airline will hire you for customer-facing positions. Rebecca began to cry again, but this time her tears carried the weight of complete professional destruction. She had gambled her career on the assumption that she could humiliate 2 elderly black passengers without consequences. She had lost spectacularly. Jasmine Carter, who had been watching the entire confrontation with a mixture of horror and fascination, stepped forward. Mr. Mitchell, what would you like me to do about the rest of the flight crew? Good question, Roland replied. He looked around the first-class cabin, making eye contact with every crew member present. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened here today represents a failure of leadership, training, and oversight. Every crew member who witnessed Ms. Coleman's behavior and failed to intervene bears some responsibility for allowing it to continue. Captain Stevens shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Mitchell, I tried to de-escalate the situation when I was called forward. Captain Stevens, Roland acknowledged, you did attempt to find a middle ground. But what you should have done was immediately recognize that one of your crew members was engaging in discriminatory behavior and put a stop to it. Yes, sir, Captain Stevens replied, his voice heavy with the recognition of his own failure. The other flight attendants, who had been quietly observing from the galley area, exchanged worried glances. They understood that their own jobs might be in jeopardy based on their failure to speak up when they witnessed discrimination. But Roland's next words surprised them. However, he said, I also recognize that crew members are often reluctant to challenge senior staff, especially in front of passengers. Ms. Carter, your willingness to speak up and defend these passengers, even at risk to your own position, demonstrates the kind of courage and integrity we need more of in this company. Jasmine smiled slightly, relief evident on her face. As for the rest of the crew, Roland continued, you'll all undergo mandatory retraining on civil rights, anti-discrimination policies, and passenger relations. Consider this incident a learning opportunity. The next time you witness discriminatory behavior, I expect you to act decisively to stop it. Margaret Stevens, the elderly passenger who had spoken up earlier, raised her hand slightly. Mr. Mitchell, what can passengers do when we witness this kind of treatment? Excellent question, Mrs. Stevens, Roland replied. First, document everything. Record video if possible, take notes, gather witness information. Second, speak up in the moment if you feel safe doing so. Discrimination thrives in silence. Third, report incidents immediately to the flight crew, and if the flight crew is involved, report to corporate headquarters as soon as possible. He looked around the cabin again. What happened here today was witnessed by dozens of people, recorded on multiple devices, and will soon be seen by millions more. That level of transparency and accountability is exactly what we need to eliminate discrimination from air travel. Dorothy Washington, who had been listening quietly to the entire exchange, finally spoke up. Mr. Mitchell, we appreciate everything you're doing to address this situation. But we want you to know that this isn't the first time something like this has happened to us. Roland's expression grew serious. Can you tell me more about that, Mrs. Washington? Well, Dorothy continued, we've been flying for over 50 years, and we've experienced subtle discrimination many times. Flight attendants who are less friendly, passengers who act surprised to see us in first class, gate agents who question our tickets more thoroughly than they question other passengers' tickets. Usually, it's not as blatant as what happened today, Clarence added. Usually, it's small things that could be explained away as coincidence or misunderstanding. But when you experience it repeatedly over decades, you recognize the pattern. Roland nodded grimly. Mr. and Mrs. Washington, what you're describing is exactly why we need systemic change, not just individual accountability. One terminated employee doesn't solve the broader problem of unconscious bias and institutional discrimination. That's when he made an announcement that would reshape how Skyline Airways approached diversity and inclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, addressing all the passengers in first class, I want to make a commitment to you and to Mr. and Mrs. Washington specifically. Within 30 days, Skyline Airways will implement a new passenger rights program. Every passenger will have access to a direct hotline for reporting discrimination. Every incident will be investigated by an independent third party, and every employee, from ground crew to senior management, will undergo comprehensive civil rights training. Furthermore, he continued, we'll be establishing an external advisory board composed of civil rights organizations, community leaders, and passengers who have experienced discrimination. This board will have the authority to review our policies, investigate complaints, and recommend changes to prevent incidents like this one. The passengers began to murmur their approval. Kevin Harper, still recording, turned his phone toward his own face. You're witnessing history here, he said to his audience. This is how a company should respond when its employees engage in discrimination. But Roland wasn't finished making commitments. Mr. and Mrs. Washington, he said, I'd like to offer you lifetime first-class travel on any Skyline Airways flight, anywhere we fly. It's a small gesture compared to the humiliation you've endured today, but it's a start. Clarence and Dorothy exchanged glances, then Clarence spoke for both of them. Mr. Mitchell, we appreciate the offer, but what we'd really like is for you to ensure that no other passengers have to go through what we experienced today. That's exactly what we're going to do, Roland replied. And I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to serve on our new passenger advisory board. Your experience and perspective would be invaluable in helping us create real change. Dorothy smiled for the first time since the incident began. We'd be honored to help, she said, as Roland Mitchell stood in the first-class cabin of his own aircraft, surrounded by passengers who had witnessed both the worst and best of corporate leadership. He understood that the next few hours would define not just his company's reputation, but its soul. The hard work of institutional change was just beginning. The plane remained at the gate for 47 minutes past its scheduled departure time. In the airline industry, every minute of delay costs money, creates ripple effects throughout the system, and inconveniences passengers who have connecting flights and important appointments. But Roland Mitchell had made a decision that transcended profit margins and operational efficiency. Some moments required time to process, document, and address properly. This was one of those moments. While Rebecca Coleman sat in the galley area, her career in ruins and her future uncertain, Roland Mitchell moved methodically through the first-class cabin, speaking personally with each passenger who had witnessed the discrimination incident. He wasn't just collecting statements for a corporate investigation. He was bearing witness to their shock, their anger, and their demands for accountability. Kevin Harper, the business traveler who had recorded the entire incident, was uploading edited clips to Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. His captions were simple but powerful. Skyline Airways flight attendant racially profiles elderly black couple. Watch the airline owner's response. The videos were already gaining traction, being shared and commented on by thousands of users. Mr. Harper, Roland said, approaching his seat, I want to thank you for documenting what happened here today. Without that evidence, it would be much harder to hold people accountable. Kevin looked up from his phone. Mr. Mitchell, I've been flying for business for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. The way your employee treated that couple was disgusting, but your response has been incredible. We have a long way to go, Roland replied. One appropriate response doesn't undo decades of systemic problems in the airline industry. 3 rows back, Margaret and Harold Stevens, the elderly white couple who had spoken up in defense of the Washingtons, were discussing the incident in hushed tones. Roland approached them next. Mr. and Mrs. Stevens, thank you for speaking up when you saw injustice happening. It takes courage to intervene when someone else is being mistreated. Margaret looked up at him with eyes that had seen 8 decades of American social change. Mr. Mitchell, Harold and I lived through the civil rights era. We watched buses being desegregated, lunch counters being integrated, and schools being forced to admit black students. We thought those battles had been won. In many ways, they have been, Roland replied. But as we saw today, individual prejudices still exist and they still cause real harm to real people. Harold spoke up. What's your plan for making sure this doesn't happen again? It was the question Roland had been asking himself since the moment he witnessed Rebecca Coleman's behavior. Complete reform, he said. New hiring practices, enhanced training programs, independent oversight, and zero tolerance for discrimination at any level of the company. As he continued his conversations with passengers, Roland's phone buzzed constantly with calls from corporate headquarters, media outlets, and crisis management consultants. Each message was urgent, each caller demanding immediate attention. But Roland ignored them all. The people on this aircraft, the passengers who had witnessed discrimination, and the elderly couple who had experienced it, deserved his undivided attention. Meanwhile, Jasmine Carter had taken over Rebecca Coleman's duties with remarkable professionalism. She was checking on passengers, answering questions, and managing the delayed departure with grace and competence. Her intervention during the discrimination incident had revealed leadership qualities that her supervisors had never recognized. Ms. Carter, Roland said, approaching the galley where she was preparing service items, you handled yourself exceptionally well today. Your willingness to speak up when you saw wrongdoing is exactly the kind of integrity we need in leadership positions. Jasmine looked surprised. Leadership positions? How would you feel about a promotion to senior flight attendant? Roland asked. Along with a significant pay increase and additional responsibility for training new crew members on civil rights and passenger relations. Jasmine's eyes widened. Sir, I would be honored, but I've only been with the company for 3 years. Experience matters, Roland said, but character matters more. You demonstrated today that you'll stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. That's the kind of person I want training our future employees. From her seat in row 2A, Dorothy Washington had been watching Roland's interactions with the other passengers. She turned to her husband and whispered, Clarence, that man is doing something I've never seen an airline executive do before. What's that? Clarence asked. He's taking responsibility, really taking responsibility, not just apologizing and hoping it goes away. Clarence nodded thoughtfully. He's treating this like it matters to him personally, not just as a business problem to be managed. Their conversation was interrupted by Roland's approach. Mr. and Mrs. Washington, he said, I've spoken with every passenger who witnessed today's incident. I want you to know that their accounts are consistent and they all support your version of events completely. We appreciate that, Clarence replied, but we also want you to know that we understand how difficult this situation is for you as a business owner. We don't want to cause problems for your company. Roland sat down in the empty seat across the aisle from them. Mr. Washington, with respect, you didn't cause any problems. One of my employees caused problems by treating you with disrespect and discrimination. Your only mistake was expecting to be treated like human beings while flying on a commercial aircraft. Dorothy reached over and patted Roland's hand gently. Son, you remind me of my grandson. He's about your age, and he has the same sense of right and wrong that you're showing today. Thank you, Mrs. Washington. That means more to me than you know. The conversation was interrupted by Captain Stevens's voice over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for departure. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for takeoff. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, Roland made one more announcement to the first-class passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience during our extended ground time. What happened on this aircraft today was unacceptable, and your willingness to serve as witnesses to discrimination and accountability will help ensure it never happens again." He paused, looking directly at Clarence and Dorothy Washington. "To Mr. and Mrs. Washington specifically, I want to say that you handled an impossible situation with dignity and grace. You have my personal commitment that Skyline Airways will do better, and will be better because of what happened here today." As the plane taxied toward the runway, passengers throughout the aircraft were processing what they had witnessed. Word had spread from first class to coach about the discrimination incident and the owner's response. Some passengers were texting updates to friends and family. Others were posting on social media. A few were making phone calls to news outlets. Rebecca Coleman, still confined to the galley area, stared out the small window at the airport buildings passing by. In the span of 1 hour, she had gone from senior flight attendant to terminated employee, from respected crew member to viral symbol of workplace discrimination. The weight of her actions was beginning to sink in, not just the immediate consequences, but the long-term impact on her career, her reputation, and her future. She thought about the training sessions she had attended, the diversity workshops she had sat through, the policies she had signed acknowledging her understanding of anti-discrimination laws. All of that knowledge had been available to her, but she had chosen to ignore it in favor of her own prejudices and assumptions. Jasmine Carter, now serving as senior flight attendant, approached the galley. "Rebecca," she said quietly, "Mr. Mitchell wants to speak with you once we're airborne." Rebecca nodded without speaking. What was there to say? She had been caught engaging in textbook racial profiling, recorded doing it, and confronted about it by the owner of the airline. Her termination was not just justified but inevitable. As Flight 447 climbed toward its cruising altitude, Roland Mitchell settled into an empty first-class seat and opened his laptop. He had emails to write, policies to revise, and a company culture to transform. The incident with Rebecca Coleman had revealed systemic problems that went far beyond one employee's bad judgment. His first email was to Lisa Bennett, his head of human resources. "Lisa," he typed, "effective immediately. I want a comprehensive review of all discrimination complaints filed against Skyline Airways in the past 5 years. I want to know how many were dismissed without proper investigation, how many employees were protected despite problematic behavior, and what patterns exist across our system." His second email was to the company's training department. "Current diversity training is clearly inadequate. I want a complete overhaul of our civil rights education program with mandatory recertification for all customer-facing employees. I also want to bring in external consultants to audit our hiring practices and identify potential bias in our recruitment and promotion processes." His third email was to the legal department. "Prepare for potential civil rights litigation related to today's incident. Also research the feasibility of establishing an independent ombudsman program for passenger discrimination complaints. I want external oversight of our internal processes." As he worked, Roland could hear quiet conversations throughout the first-class cabin. Passengers were discussing what they had witnessed, sharing their own experiences with discrimination, and debating the broader implications of the incident. The conversation was exactly what America needed to be having about race, privilege, and accountability. Kevin Harper, still processing and uploading video clips, had gained over 50,000 followers since the incident began. His documentation of corporate accountability in real time was resonating with viewers who were accustomed to seeing companies deflect blame and minimize problems. Margaret Stevens leaned across the aisle to speak with the Washingtons. "How are you feeling about everything that's happened?" Dorothy smiled tiredly. "Grateful, mainly. Grateful that other passengers spoke up, grateful that Mr. Mitchell took action, and grateful that this incident might prevent other families from going through the same thing." Clarence added, We've experienced discrimination before, but we've never seen it addressed so directly and immediately. Usually, complaints disappear into corporate bureaucracy and nothing changes. This time feels different, Margaret agreed. That young man, pointing toward Roland, seems genuinely committed to making changes. As the flight continued toward Los Angeles, the ripple effects of the incident were spreading across social media and news networks. Skyline accountability was trending on Twitter. Major news outlets were picking up the story. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements praising Roland Mitchell's response while demanding industry-wide reforms. But for Roland, the real measure of success wouldn't be public relations or media coverage. It would be whether Skyline Airways could transform its culture so thoroughly that no passenger would ever again experience what Clarence and Dorothy Washington had endured. The work of institutional change was just beginning, and Roland Mitchell understood that the eyes of the world would be watching to see if his promises of reform would be kept. 6 months after Flight 447 landed in Los Angeles, Skyline Airways had become a completely different company. The discrimination incident that began with Rebecca Coleman's racial profiling of the Washingtons had triggered the most comprehensive corporate transformation in airline industry history. Roland Mitchell hadn't just fired one problematic employee. He had rebuilt his company's entire approach to diversity, inclusion, and passenger rights. The Skyline Airways training facility in Phoenix buzzed with activity on a Tuesday morning in February. In Conference Room A, 30 flight attendants were participating in the new Civil Rights and Passenger Dignity Training Program. The course was mandatory for all customer-facing employees, lasted 3 full days, and was taught by civil rights attorneys, diversity consultants, and passengers who had experienced discrimination. Leading today's session was Jasmine Carter, who had been promoted to Director of Passenger Experience Training after her courageous intervention during the Washington incident. Her role was to share real-world examples of discrimination and teach employees how to recognize and prevent biased treatment of passengers. Today, we're going to watch footage from an actual incident that occurred on one of our flights, Jasmine announced to the training group. I want you to pay attention not just to the obvious discrimination, but to the warning signs that appeared early in the interaction. The room fell silent as the now famous video of Rebecca Coleman profiling the Washingtons played on the large screen. Even 6 months later, watching the footage was uncomfortable for Skyline employees. It represented the worst of what their company had been, and the distance they still needed to travel to become what Roland Mitchell envisioned. After the video ended, Jasmine facilitated a discussion about implicit bias, customer service protocols, and the difference between legitimate security concerns and discriminatory profiling. The conversation was frank, sometimes heated, but always educational. One flight attendant raised her hand. What should we do if we witness a colleague engaging in discriminatory behavior? Jasmine's answer was immediate and clear. You intervene immediately, you speak up, you document what you see, and you report it through our new incident reporting system. Silence in the face of discrimination makes you complicit in the discrimination. Meanwhile, in the executive offices at Skyline headquarters in Seattle, Roland Mitchell was reviewing the quarterly report from the company's new Independent Passenger Advocacy Board. The board, composed of civil rights leaders, community activists, and passengers who had experienced discrimination, had the authority to investigate complaints, recommend policy changes, and hold the company accountable for its commitments to equality. The report was encouraging. Discrimination complaints were down 78% from the previous year. Passenger satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Employee retention had improved significantly as workers felt more confident in their company's values and more empowered to speak up when they witnessed problems. But Roland knew that statistics only told part of the story. Real change was measured in individual experiences, in passengers who felt welcome and respected, in employees who felt proud of the company they worked for. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his office door. "Come in," he called. Lisa Bennett, his head of human resources, entered with a folder in her hand. "Roland, I have some news I think you'll find interesting." "What's that?" "Rebecca Coleman has applied for a position with Delta Airlines. They contacted us for a reference check." Roland leaned back in his chair. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them the truth, that she was terminated for engaging in racial profiling of passengers, that the incident was documented on video, and that she showed no genuine remorse for her actions." "Good," Roland said. "Companies need to share information about employees who engage in discriminatory behavior. If we don't, we're just passing the problem from one airline to another." Lisa nodded. "There's something else. Clarence and Dorothy Washington are here for the advisory board meeting this afternoon. They wanted to stop by and thank you personally for the changes you've made." Roland smiled. "Send them in whenever they're ready. I always have time for them." 10 minutes later, the couple who had catalyzed the transformation of Skyline Airways entered Roland's office. Clarence, now 74, walked with a slight limp but carried himself with the same dignity he had shown during the discrimination incident. Dorothy, 72, was carrying a gift bag and wearing the kind of smile that could light up a room. "Mr. and Mrs. Washington," Roland said, standing to greet them. "How are you doing?" "We're doing wonderfully," Dorothy replied, setting down her gift bag. "And we wanted to bring you something to show our appreciation." "You didn't need to bring me anything," Roland protested. "You've already given me more than you know." Clarence laughed. Dorothy insisted. "You know how grandmothers are." Dorothy opened the gift bag and pulled out a framed photograph. It showed their grandson Marcus in his USC graduation cap and gown, flanked by his proud grandparents. The inscription at the bottom read, "To Roland Mitchell, who turned our worst travel experience into the catalyst for positive change. Thank you for proving that accountability and kindness still matter." Roland studied the photograph, genuinely moved by the gesture. "How is Marcus doing?" "He's doing great," Clarence replied. "He got accepted to graduate school at Stanford, and he's planning to study business ethics. He says he wants to be the kind of leader you are." "That's quite a compliment," Roland said. "I hope I can live up to it." "You already have," Dorothy said firmly. "Do you know what the most important thing you did that day was?" "What's that?" "You listened. When we told you what was happening to us, you didn't dismiss it or minimize it or try to explain it away. You listened, and then you acted." Roland nodded thoughtfully. "That seems like the bare minimum of decent behavior." "Maybe it should be," Clarence said. "But in our experience, it's rarer than you might think." They spent the next hour discussing the advisory board meeting agenda, the company's progress on diversity initiatives, and their own experiences flying with Skyline Airways since the incident. Every flight had been positive, they reported. Flight attendants were more attentive, gate agents were more respectful, and the overall atmosphere was more welcoming. Before they left, Dorothy had one more question. "Roland, what happened to the flight attendant who treated us so poorly? Rebecca Coleman?" Roland sighed. "She was terminated immediately as promised. She applied for positions with other airlines, but word spread quickly in the industry about what she had done. She's working in retail now, I believe." "Do you ever wonder if she learned anything from what happened?" Dorothy asked. "I hope she did," Roland replied. "I hope she looks back on that day and understands that her actions had real consequences for real people. But honestly, I spend more time thinking about how to prevent other employees from making the same mistakes she made." That afternoon, the Independent Passenger Advocacy Board met in Skyline's main conference room. The board included civil rights attorneys, community leaders, disability rights advocates, and passengers who had experienced discrimination. Their mandate was simple but powerful: hold Skyline Airways accountable for its promises of equal treatment and dignity for all passengers. The meeting began with a presentation from Jasmine Carter about the new training programs. She reported that 98% of Skyline employees had completed the mandatory civil rights training, and feedback scores were consistently high. More importantly, employees were reporting increased confidence in handling difficult situations and greater willingness to intervene when they witnessed discriminatory behavior. Next, Lisa Bennett presented data on discrimination complaints. The numbers were dramatic. Complaints were down significantly, resolution times had improved, and passenger satisfaction with the complaint process had increased substantially. But the most powerful part of the meeting came when board members shared feedback from their communities. A disability rights advocate reported that passengers with disabilities were experiencing much better treatment and accommodation. A representative from the NAACP noted that Black passengers were reporting more positive experiences across all aspects of air travel. An advocate for elderly passengers mentioned that older travelers felt more respected and valued. Roland listened carefully to every concern and recommendation. When the formal presentation ended, he addressed the board directly. 6 months ago, this company failed spectacularly in its responsibility to treat all passengers with dignity and respect. What happened to Mr. and Mrs. Washington was unacceptable, but it wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of deeper problems in our culture and our systems. He paused, looking around the room at faces that represented the diversity of America's traveling public. Today, I can say with confidence that we are a different company. Not perfect, not finished with our work, but fundamentally different in our approach to diversity, inclusion, and passenger rights. And that change is permanent because it's not just policy-driven, it's culture-driven. After the board meeting, Roland walked through Skyline's headquarters, stopping to chat with employees at all levels. In the customer service department, he found representatives handling calls with patience and professionalism. In the operations center, he saw diverse teams of dispatchers, mechanics, and supervisors working together seamlessly. But the real test of Skyline's transformation wasn't in corporate offices or training facilities. It was in airports and aircraft where employees interacted with passengers every day. Reports from across the system were consistently positive. The company that had once made headlines for discrimination was now being praised as an industry leader in passenger rights and employee accountability. That evening, Roland sat in his home office, reviewing the day's events and planning for the challenges ahead. On his desk was the framed photograph from the Washingtons, a daily reminder of why his work mattered. Next to it was a letter from a passenger thanking Skyline for respectful treatment during a difficult travel situation. Beside that was a report showing record-high employee satisfaction scores. But Roland knew that transformation was an ongoing process, not a destination. Every day brought new opportunities to choose inclusion over exclusion, respect over prejudice, and accountability over defensiveness. The work would continue long after the headlines faded and the viral videos were forgotten. His computer chimed with a new email. It was from Kevin Harper, the passenger who had recorded the original discrimination incident. Kevin was writing to let Roland know that his documentation of corporate accountability had inspired him to start a non-profit organization focused on passenger rights advocacy. Roland smiled as he read the email. Sometimes the most important changes happen not because of corporate policies or training programs, but because individuals chose to stand up, speak out, and demand better from the institutions they encountered. As he prepared to leave the office, Roland's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jasmine Carter, reporting from a flight where she was working as a senior crew member. "Everything went perfectly today," the message read. "Passengers were happy, crew was professional, and I felt proud to wear the Skyline uniform." That, Roland thought, was what transformation looked like. Not press releases or policy manuals, but employees who felt proud of their company and passengers who felt respected and valued. It was the difference between cosmetic change and cultural evolution. 6 months after Rebecca Coleman had humiliated an elderly Black couple in first class, Skyline Airways had become proof that companies could change, that accountability could lead to improvement, and that the right leadership could transform institutional culture. The work continued because the goal wasn't just to avoid discrimination. The goal was to create an environment where every passenger, regardless of race, age, income, or background, felt welcome from the moment they booked their ticket until they reached their destination. It was ambitious, it was ongoing, and it was absolutely necessary. And it had all started with two passengers who refused to accept mistreatment, an employee who chose courage over silence, and a leader who understood that true accountability requires more than apologies. It requires action, commitment, and the recognition that some changes are worth any cost. As Roland locked his office and headed home, he carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that his company had chosen the harder path of genuine transformation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that change was real and permanent. But tonight he could rest, knowing that Clarence and Dorothy Washington would never again experience discrimination on a Skyline Airways flight, and neither would any other passenger. That was a promise worth keeping and a legacy worth building. The story of Flight 447 had ended, but the story of institutional change was just beginning. If you believe that accountability and respect should be standard in customer service, share this story. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and remember that your voice matters when you witness injustice. Because sometimes speaking up for what's right changes everything.